Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. If you will take your seats, please. Thank you. We're trying to start on time. We have a big program tonight, a lot to cover. So anyway, good evening. And thank you so much for coming. My name is Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Network for Responsible Public Policy and our co-sponsors for tonight's program, the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley and the League of Women Voters of Fairlawn. I also want to really thank the Emmanuel Church, Don Wheeler, and the pastors that did something really fantastic. They endorsed our program, and 15 people have come from the church carpooling. So let's give them a hand. I also want to give a hat tip to Jessica Sherman. Jessica, would you stand up? Jessica has been, she's been an intern for NFRPP for many years, and she just graduated from Ramapo College in Environmental Science. Yeah. I also want to wish Professor Kent Fairfield well. He's been a friend of NFRPP and has helped us with our environmental programs and been a liaison often for our programs here. And he will be retiring. He's been a professor at FDU for many years. Kent, we want to wish you well. So, we are coming to the close of our spring series. NFRPP has one more program. It will be June 14th at the Teaneck Library, 10:30 in the morning, and that program will cover regulations. We then take a breather in July and August, and then we'll be back in September in full form with an incredible lineup of speakers, nationally recognized thought leaders, and on some great topics. So look forward to September, October, November, and some of the great programs we will be providing. I also urge you to contact us, and if you have topics that you think we should be covering and speakers that maybe we can introduce to the public, please let us know. We're always looking for those opportunities. So, the other thing I want to thank you for, because many of you have helped us by just passing the word about our programs and introducing us to others, and that's one of the best ways for us to reach more people, and we're always looking to reach more people and do the fine education that we do. So now, I would like to get started. We have a lot to cover tonight, as I said, and our format will be that our four speakers will each give their brief presentations, and then our moderator will conduct a dialogue with them, and then we will open the program up, as we do, to the public for our Q&A. So let's get started, and let me introduce you to Eric Roston. Eric will be our moderator. He is the sustainability editor of Bloomberg News and writes frequently about climate science and policy. An author and public speaker, Eric spearheaded some of the Bloomberg News' most high-profile climate-related graphics of recent years. You can follow him on Bloomberg.com and on Twitter. So let me introduce you to Eric Roston.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the NFRPP for putting the event together. Shortly after the November elections, when the Democrats took back Congress, this phrase, Green New Deal, started circulating in the press. It's actually a much older phrase, going back maybe 10 or 15 years. That was not quite codified earlier this year when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey issued sort of a preliminary overview of what the Green New Deal might look like, largely an effort to zero out carbon emissions from the US economy in a rather short period of time. And they married that to some standard democratic policy goals that have been sort of perennials. Tonight we're going to focus on what a Green New Deal might look like from 4 experts who have really thought about what practically it would take to solve these problems. I'll introduce them as they go. For starters, we'll have Dr. Eben Goodstein, who is the Director of Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College, the author of several books, and he'll give us a sort of an economic overview of what's possible here.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Rhoda, for your organizing and putting this together, and thank you all for coming out on such a lovely evening. My job is really to kind of set up the context for the Green New Deal, and I'm going to do that by talking around a project that we're running out of Bard this year called Solve Climate by 2030, and you can just Google that or just solveclimateby2030.org if you want to get any more information about what I'm talking about tonight. Because that really is what's behind the Green New Deal, right? Is this sense of urgency that, you know, we really do only have for real now. People have been saying it for a while, but 10 years, if we're going to hold global heating to the low end of 1.5 degrees C. I mean, it's clear that if we don't get it done by then, we're looking at 2 or more. So that's kind of the motivating idea of the Green New Deal, is it recognizes the moment we're in and want to push forward. And the subtext for how this would happen is these 2 words, solar dominance and citizen action. And I want to talk a little bit about those. So, okay, I want to advance the slides. Which one do I hit? That one? Nope. Thank you. Is it enter? Okay, that one. No, stuff is happening. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I put a big word up there, solve climate. What does that mean? Well, it means that by 2030, we will be well on our way towards a 100% renewable economy with electric power from solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, and storage, kind of a new word, which just means mostly batteries, but batteries everywhere. And transportation rapidly transitioning towards electric vehicles, powered in turn off of that new renewable energy economy. That's what solving climate by 2030 means, at least the energy half. There's a whole other half around land management and forestry, and but really this is a big half, and so we want to try and get that done. I use this term solar dominance, and what that means is that technically the point at which 50% of global electric power is going to be produced by solar plus storage. Okay, why solar dominance and not renewable dominance? And the answer is, by the early to mid-2020s, and that's just a couple of years away, solar plus storage is going to be much cheaper than power from the grid in many places. So let me say that again. Within a few years, short years, solar plus storage is going to be much cheaper than power from the grid. Okay? And in addition, unlike with all other electricity sources, you don't need a utility to produce your own power. So millions and millions of people and companies can and will start to produce and store their own power really soon. So every factory, warehouse, business, building, shopping center, house, parking lot, device, everywhere will have solar. This is from Tony Seba, who's been a real thought leader in this space. And so I think kind of what's new about this moment is a recognition that the global economy will be a solar-dominated economy relatively soon, but the question is, how soon? Could this really happen in 10 years? Well, the reason is solar has been on a steady march since its inception in 1976, especially the last 20 years, where it's been doubling in installed capacity every 2 years, falling in price by 10% every year. And that really is transformative. California is headed towards residential solar power at 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour. soon. 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour. We pay 17, 18 cents a kilowatt hour here in New York, New Jersey, right? Battery prices doing the same thing. And so this is kind of the story, right? You know, this is a nationwide average, about 13 cents a kilowatt hour right now, and rising because the grid is creaky and old and requires a lot of upgrades to meet the demands that people are putting on it for smart power. So retail grid prices are going to continue to rise, but here in this part of the world, or actually throughout the United States, unsubsidized utility scale solar is now beating the grid. So we've got a development that's going up in, or not beating the grid, beating natural gas and basically all the other electric generating technologies. We've got a big solar farm going up in Greene County in New York, but out in the West, in Idaho and Colorado, they've had bids of sort of baseload power, which is solar, wind plus storage, coming in at 2.5 cents, 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and the best that natural gas can do is 4 cents. So from this moment forward, basically globally, you're going to see very little new power installed at a utility scale that's not solar or wind. So we're already there in terms of solar dominance as the utility scale source of electricity. But what's really interesting is when distributed solar plus battery storage crosses that line, and that's going to happen in a couple of years, where it's going to be cheaper for me as a residence or a business to install solar panels on the roof, throw some batteries in there so I can power my system overnight, and for 8 or 9 months, I'll be able to be grid free. And then I'll have to rely on the grid for 4 months up here because we don't get enough sun. I can't store power over 4 months. And this is really the recipe for true market disruption and the kind of rapid penetration of solar that would get us to dominance by, say, 2030. And this idea of partial grid defection, okay? People will start to use the grid as backup power, but increasingly they're going to generate and store their own power. This will lead to the famed utility death spiral. You know, as more and more people rely less and less on the grid, there'll be fewer and fewer people to pay for it. So there'll be a lot of political pushback, and there's real questions about justice and how do you address people who can't afford solar and all that stuff. But that won't stop it. And we can sort of think quaintly about the days we used to use telephone wires. Actually, I called somebody up today on a landline, and you know what I heard? A busy signal. When was the last time you heard a busy signal? It was like, whoa, what a throwback. Okay? So that's where we're headed, folks. And the question again is, could this happen by 2030? Well, to get there, this is the magic that has to happen, right? So we're at only 2% of global power produced by solar last year. By 2020, we're on track for 4%. And if that doubling continues, 5 more times, then you get to 64% of today's power production being produced by solar in 2028. Okay, that's a big if, obviously, but this is the trend that solar has been on. It's been doubling every 2 years. And it really forces us to think about solar in a very different light. Is it going to be like those other technologies that have exploded in our lifetime? So if you were to ask people in 2007, you know, when the first smartphone came out, how many people do you think will have these things in 10 years? Nobody would have ever said 2.5 billion and 1/3 of the global population, right? So we know that these kind of technology disruptions can happen fast, and I think that we need to start thinking about solar and storage in this context. It's not going to be incremental, it's going to be massively disruptive, which has good sides and bad sides, and we can talk about that. Okay, what about the vehicle side? Because we got to transform vehicles as well. So we got to make a transition from internal combustion engines, that's the ICE, to electric vehicles. Can we do that by 2030? Well, there's a guy named Tony Seba, whose video I will highly recommend, who sketches out a path in which autonomous ride sharing explodes over the next decade. And the first thing to recognize here is that if that happens, the Lyft and Uber fleets that are going to be providing those services are going to be electric, because electric vehicles are just way cheaper to maintain, service, fuel, and they last 2 to 4 times as long as ICE vehicles. So everybody that's in this game is already going electric. Waymo, Didi, Cruise, Tesla, everybody who's betting on this is already moving their fleets to electric, away from ICE vehicles. Didi's going to have 1 million electric vehicles in their rideshare fleet in China within 2 years. So that will be the driver, and the question is that gonna happen? And I love my little graphic there. SEBA says that autonomous ride sharing will technologically be ready to go in 2021. That seems mind-blowing, but Waymo, for example, is already doing this in Phoenix. You can get an autonomous vehicle to come pick you up with no driver and take you around Phoenix right now. If that's true, then you're going to have a choice in 2021 of buying a new car, all in, lease, gas, maintenance, insurance, costs you $900 a month. That's what a car costs you. Or you can pay $100 a month for a ride-sharing service that will get you anywhere you want to go. So that's a 10x, right? And so SEBA says that's going to lead to an incredibly rapid transition, the collapse of the automobile industry, and a rapid transition to autonomous electric vehicles as a service, and none of us will ever drive again. Which is also mind-blowing, right? But we got to think big, right? You know, if we're really going to solve climate by 2030, and that's what we have to do, this is a realistic path to get you there, right? Solar dominance and electric vehicle dominance. And there are powerful market forces pushing in this direction. I think that's the important point. We've gotten to the point now where policy is important for these tools, but not critical. It could be that the market will substantially take over. I don't think it'll get us there fast enough. And, you know, that's why we're here. I'd like to point out that the planet heated up 0.5 degree Fahrenheit in that 3-year period. Very few people know that. It's dramatic. So we don't have a lot of time. And that was the headline that motivated this. Here's another way to look at this. You know, if we do our best, oh, and there's that 0.5 degree Fahrenheit in 3 years. This is where we wind up. You know, if we get it done, if we make that transition that I just talked about, if we meet the Paris agreements, that's where we're headed. And if we just keep all moving along in a Trump world, that's our destination, you know, within my children's lifetimes. So the other piece here, though, is citizen action. I mean, solar dominance is cool, but citizens are going to be necessary to do 3 things. One, speed those first solar doublings, make sure they happen, and that often requires state and local action. Do the other 100 things we have to do to solve climate that don't have those market tailwinds. And also, and this is really where the Green New Deal comes in, really ensure a just transition through these rapid transitions of energy and society that are going to come regardless. But if they were to come fast enough to solve climate, we're talking about kind of the mother of all economic disruptions. You know, it's not just, you know, Uber and Lyft drivers, it's drivers everywhere. You know, it's utility, it's insurance, it's vehicles, it's the whole deal. So if we were to really solve climate by 2030, it would be massively economically disruptive, and the government would need to help out to ensure that we get the benefits of that transition while we're making it quickly. So I think I'll pause here because I think I've taken up my time, but I want to just point out the other 100 solutions. Drawdown is a great source for this. I suspect most people in the audience are aware of drawdown.org. I've highlighted about 6 of these solutions because I think that we need to recognize that these are going to happen, and they're going to happen fast. We can make them happen faster. The other 95 or so really require really engaged and sustained citizen involvement to drive the policy changes we need. So at the end of the day, again, why a Green New Deal? Those 3 things. Solve climate by 2030.org. We hope to involve next year 100,000 students in a dialogue about these issues across the country, 50 states. So check it out, and glad to talk about that more later.
Thanks, Eben. There's a lot of hard questions tonight For me, the easiest one is probably the last time I got a busy signal, which was at Daikichi in Montclair, a wonderful sushi place. It's ringing off the hook. Next up is Dr. Todd Vachon, a faculty member at the School of Management at Labor and Labor Relations at Rutgers, who'll give us some perspective on the intersection of the Green New Deal and inequality.
I was told there was only one.
Oh, no. Okay.
All right.
I'll use that segue to grab some water.
Glad to see the real glasses, so kudos to that. No plastic, right? All right. Just get over to mine. Okay. There. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. As was mentioned, my name is Todd Vachon. I'm in the Department of Labor Studies in the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit tonight more about the New Deal side of the Green New Deal, which really kind of picks up perfectly from the last presentation, where we're going to talk a bit about the just transition and why it's so essential that we consider the jobs and employment ramifications of really any solution that we may come up with for climate change, because it will be so disruptive. So, as I like to say to my students, we're living in a moment of a dual crisis of ecology and inequality. If you take just a second to look at this graphic, this juxtaposes the annual carbon emissions into the atmosphere globally with the share of income that's going to the top 1% of income earners. Notice any similarities? So the world's top 28 billionaires now own as much as the poorest 3.8 billion humans. The richest 10% are responsible for nearly half of carbon emissions from consumption. So it's a dual crisis of ecology and inequality because obviously we're facing a climate emergency. Science tells us we need to take bold and immediate solutions in order to avoid the worst of this. But we're also facing high levels, unprecedented levels of income and wealth inequality, often along the lines of race and gender, which threatens the very foundations of democratic governance. So in the United States today, the top 10% of wealthy people own 70% of all wealth, whereas the bottom 50% of people share just 1% of wealth in society. The top 1% of earners bring home 22% of all income annually. This is unsustainable economically. Previous attempts to address either one of these problems separately have often led to eruptions of what are called jobs versus the environment conflicts. So this is just one kind of typical picture of coal miners protesting against EPA protections that would put their members out of work. So climate mitigation and jobs. As was mentioned by Eben, getting to 100% renewable energy is going to have massive shifts in employment. The types of jobs, the number of jobs, the location of jobs, the skills required for jobs, all of these things are going to be changed rapidly and radically. Compared to the baseline business as usual scenario, we're obviously going to have a decline in fossil fuel jobs, right? If we're not burning coal or oil or natural gas, then all the jobs associated with that are going to be going away. Simultaneously, in order to install and operate all of the renewable power sources, there's going to be an upsurge in jobs in the renewable sector. Most studies show that this will actually create more jobs in the short run because of the massive investments in infrastructure construction, in installing and creating a brand new smart grid that's based off of renewable sources. In the short run, we'll create more jobs. However, in the long run, much of this power supply is going to be less labor intensive, so ultimately we'll have less jobs in the long run, particularly if folks are just powering their homes with their own solar panels, as was mentioned. So that gets rid of the utility scale, and that's a lot of jobs in that sector that will be gone. So the fact that there's going to be more jobs is of little comfort to the particular workers that are losing their job, right? I should mention that prior to returning to college to earn my PhD, I was a union carpenter for a number of years, and I worked in the energy sector in Eastern Connecticut, including in nuclear power plants. And a pretty common refrain among our union leadership and others is that one job that exists today is worth more than 1 million jobs promised by a politician at some undetermined point in the future, right? So why is it such a big deal for workers facing job loss, right? We can just go out and get another job, right? Well, actually, one of the big issues is there's a tremendous disparity in bargaining power between these old jobs that are going to go away and the new jobs that are coming online. So what do I mean by disparity in bargaining power? Well, first of all, fossil fuel jobs were not always good jobs. If you go back 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago, these were really lousy, dirty, low-paying jobs. How did they become good jobs? That's an open question to you all. How do you think they became good jobs? Unions, right, exactly. Right, so workers in those industries organized and they protested and they won recognition of a union and they did collective bargaining agreements generation after generation. Some cases, grandfather, son, grandson, all in the same union for 3 generations of contracts that are continually making the jobs better jobs. Fossil fuel and defense industries at this point in time are the last vestiges of the original New Deal's labor relations systems. That's to say that unionization in the private sector in the US today is just at 6%, right? More than half of all union members in the United States are public sector workers at this point. In 1953, it was over 35% of private sector workers had unions. Union organizing has become increasingly difficult, especially since the rise of neoliberalism and the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, when he busted the PATCO air traffic controller strike. It sent a very strong signal to employers that, hey, the gloves are off, you can go out and bust unions as much as you want, and indeed that is what has been happening for the past 40 years. So most of the renewable companies are non-union, and they deploy very anti-union tactics. Perhaps most notably, Mr. Elon Musk himself, no big fan of unions. On the other hand, the fossil fuel industry has embraced unions. They didn't always embrace unions early on, but in the past 20 years or so, they have very strategically come to embrace unions because they understand that the most powerful alliance against their industry is if environmentalists and workers can come together and demand something different. So by dividing up and separating the workers and the environmentalists in purpose, that is to their advantage, right? So in a lot of cases, coming from the construction industry, I can tell you the gold standard for a construction worker union is to get a project labor agreement, which means a contracting company is going to propose a new construction project, and before that project is ever even given approval to be built, they reach out to the unions and they sign a contract and say all of the jobs building this power plant will be built by union labor paying such and such wages with such and such benefits. So that immediately creates a massive level of support for particularly natural gas plants at this point in time before they're ever built, because it's guaranteed to create those jobs and they're going to be union jobs if it gets approved. The renewable industry, on the other hand, does the opposite. They're paying much lower wages and they're busting efforts to unionize. So a typical renewable energy job pays just a fraction of what a fossil fuel job pays. Natural gas plant operators make $78,000 on average in New Jersey. Rooftop solar installers make $46,000. So why is bargaining power important? Well, obviously it's important for the particular workers, but also within society, right? I said we have this dual crisis of ecology and inequality. Well, if we look over time at the relationship between the percent of workers who have unions and the percent of all income in society going to the wealthiest 10%, again, you notice a striking correlation here. When unions have strong bargaining power, income is shared more fairly within society. In the past 30 or 40 years, as unions have declined, the share of income going to workers has also declined, with more and more wealth being concentrated at the top. So there's a disparity in bargaining power, and that also leads to a dearth in good job alternatives. What do you think is the typical education level of a fossil fuel blue-collar worker?
High school.
High school, right? How many jobs do you think pay $78,000 a year to somebody with a high school degree?
Zero.
Right? Not many. I can tell you what the two are. They're the fossil fuel jobs and they're the unionized construction worker jobs, right? Building gas power plants. So if you're asking folks that are, say, 50 years old to leave their $78,000 job, what kind of labor market are they facing with their skill set? What kind of job are they likely to get? Not a particularly good job, right? At least not paying only paying a fraction of what they were previously earning. So decades of globalization have eroded a lot of what would have been other good alternatives. This is showing the decline in manufacturing employment in the United States. That was another area of employment where, with a high school degree, you could make a middle-class income. Manufacturing has been declining due to globalization and outsourcing since the 1970s. This just shows you the inflation-adjusted average income for non-supervisory production workers, so AKA working-class folks, peaked in 1975. The wages of working class people in the United States have been worth less and less. The peak was in 1975. So think about that. There's not a lot of good alternatives. If you have one of those good blue collar union jobs with a high school degree, you really kind of want to keep it. Additionally, not so much in New Jersey's case, but nationally, geographic factors can really exacerbate these problems. That's why the coal mining issue is such a, it's often an issue that's portrayed in the media the most, because the impact there is amplified by the fact that the local economy is not diversified. It's essentially a one industry economy. And if you get rid of that one industry, you essentially tank the entire economy. All right, a third reason why it's very difficult is we have a very weak social safety net in the United States. I would gather some folks in here may have traveled abroad or have friends that have gone to Europe, and you may have heard stories about things like national health insurance and free college education. And those things are essentially pretty normal in most wealthy capitalist democracies. The United States is very much an outlier in that regard. So unlike most European countries, losing your job in the US is the equivalent of the economic death penalty, right? If you lose your job in Europe, you lose your income. When you lose your job in the United States, you lose your health insurance also for yourself, your spouse, and your children, any dependents you have. Your contributions to your retirement stop. You're no longer making contributions to Social Security if you're not working hourly. The unemployment benefits in the United States are scant and temporary and very short compared to European countries. And when it comes to just getting yourself retrained to go get a new job, well, guess who burdens all the risk of that cost of re-education, right? The individual worker tends to have to take out debt to go back to college. And that's a risk that's borne by the individual, and there's no promise or guarantee at the end of that degree that there's going to be a job there that's going to pay a livable wage. And in these times of rapidly changing technology, it's likely that by the time you get the degree, what you've learned may be obsolete. And young folks in the room are very aware of that. Finally, the existing transition programs that we do have in place, for example, the Trade Adjustment Act, these were created largely to deal with the side effects of global trade agreements such as NAFTA, are inadequate for a variety of reasons. First, they provide assistance to a very limited number of workers, so the criteria for even gaining access to it is so strict that a very small number of workers actually qualify for the benefits. The benefits themselves are very skimpy, and the inability of the job training program to guarantee a job at the end, as I said. So even if you get a free semester at community college, it's not going to guarantee that you get a job at the end. So we have a very weak transition program. So what do we need? Well, we need some kind of comprehensive solution that's going to take these matters into consideration and address the climate problem and the inequality problem simultaneously and see them as the interconnected problems that they are. So the Green New Deal, I would say, the resolution that's been put out, is one of the first pieces of climate legislation that directly acknowledges that all climate legislation is in fact economic legislation and social legislation, whether it says so or not. Because even if it just says cut carbon emissions by 80% by 2030, that's going to have economic impacts. That's going to have social impacts. The Green New Deal up front considers what those impacts might be and tries to address them preemptively and to create a just transition program that's actually viable. So I'm going to talk just real briefly about some of the work and employment related aspects actually from the Green New Deal resolution as they all pertain to some of the problems I've identified tonight. I'm going to lump them into three categories. So the first set has to do with creating new jobs, the second set has to do with a just transition, and the third set is about bringing workers' voice into the process. So in terms of job creation, the Green New Deal resolution seeks, quote, to create millions of good high-wage jobs and ensure prosperity and economic security for all people of the United States, building infrastructure projects, renewable projects, mass transit, building efficiencies, which is something we haven't talked about much here, but just making our buildings energy efficient is going to create a massive number of jobs. That's a highly labor-intensive area of climate mitigation. Now, it doesn't just want to create any old job. It wants to create good jobs. So the Green New Deal seeks to create high-quality union jobs that pay prevailing wages, hire local workers, offer trainings and advancement opportunities. So these are all quotes extracted directly from the resolution. So just some of these terms you may not be familiar with, jargony, prevailing wage. A prevailing wage states that a publicly funded construction project is going to pay what the highest wage in that local area is, aka the union wage. So that puts local contractors, it puts the labor costs out of competition for construction bid process. So all the companies are going to pay the workers this rate, whether they have a union or not in their workplace, so that the companies are then competing on the quality of what they're going to produce, the timeline, their innovative designs, et cetera, instead of basing their bid on who can pay their workers the least so they can get the cheapest bid, win with the cheapest bid. Union rights. It calls for strengthening and protecting the right of all workers to organize, unionize, and collectively bargain, free of coercion, intimidation, and harassment. And it also calls for strengthening and enforcing labor standards, workplace health and safety, anti-discrimination, and wage and hour standards across all employers, industries, and sectors. So New Jersey, being a historically blue state, much like the state I grew up in Connecticut, has quite good laws on the books regarding all of these factors. But the problem is they're often not enforced, right? The agencies are not properly staffed, they're not properly funded. So a good law and a good regulation alone is not worth much if there's no teeth behind it to enforce it. And the final piece is local jobs. So it calls for having local procurement requirements, which essentially means you need to hire a certain percentage of the workers have to come from the local area where it's being built. This is not only good for workers, but this is also good for addressing many of the environmental justice issues and the historical marginalization of certain sectors of our population who have predominantly experienced the ill effects of our previous energy system and have never benefited from it economically. All right, so that's the jobs. Now the just transition piece. So it calls for a fair and just transition for all communities and workers by guaranteeing wage and benefit parity for workers affected by the transition. Wage and benefit parity means if you lose your job in the fossil fuel sector and the government creates a job in the renewable sector, you will make the same, you'll carry your wages and benefits over parity, equal. A federal jobs guarantee. So there's been a lot of talk in recent years about having a universal basic income as a way to address a lot of these changes in the labor market, especially the technology and automation issue. But the Green New Deal takes a different approach by saying, you know, like the original New Deal said, we have a vast amount of social problems that need to be fixed and addressed. We have infrastructure that's falling apart. Why don't we create a work progress administration and put people to work fixing those problems? So you'll address the unemployment issue, you'll address the inequality issue, and you'll simultaneously address many of the problems that we have in society that have been neglected for many years. A fourth piece is it calls for providing all people of the United States with affordable health care. So this is the important part that I was talking about earlier with the social safety net. This is decoupling health insurance from employment. So when you lose your job, you don't lose your health insurance. You still have health insurance if there were, for example, a Medicare for all system or a single-payer health insurance system in the United States. And the final piece, education and training. So it calls for providing subsidized or free college education for workers that need to be retrained to do new jobs, so that risk is no longer borne by the individual. So you put all these together, you get your education, you have your insurance while you get your education, and then you're guaranteed a job at the end, and it's going to pay what your old job did. That's going to really undermine a lot of the opposition to climate change protection efforts. All right, and the final part, which is crucially important, is actually allowing workers and unions to have, and frontline communities to have a voice in the construction of the policy. There's nothing worse than a paternalistic policy of a bunch of upper middle class white men sitting in a room saying, we know what's best for you workers, we know what's best for you people of color. It's crucially important that the people who are directly impacted by these measures are able to participate in the creation of the solutions to the problems. So these are just two quotes of the ways that the Green New Deal resolution calls for that. It says ensuring the use of democratic and participatory processes that are inclusive of and led by frontline and vulnerable communities and workers to plan, implement, and administer the Green New Deal mobilization at the local level. So why are these things important? Well, here's my academic-y part of the presentation. There's two things, what I call a moral argument and what I call a pragmatic argument. The moral argument is it's just completely unfair to take a section of the society who has toiled doing the dirty, grueling work to power the economy for everybody else. And now everybody else is saying, we need to get rid of your job, right? How many people here have worked in fossil fuels? A couple, right? So how many people here have what they would call a white-collar job or a computer job, right? So all of those jobs are powered by the labor of the folks doing the dirty, dangerous fossil fuel work. So it's just unjust to make them, shoulder the economic burden of getting rid of that sector and switching to renewable jobs. That's the moral argument. The pragmatic argument is essentially this. If you want people to support legislation, it has to support them. If the legislation is attacking them, then you're essentially creating an organized opponent to the legislation, as we've seen for years and years with several unions opposing climate protection measures in the United States. Now, I will say, and this is just my personal thing, I've been involved for many years in my union in a network called Labor Network for Sustainability, which is a group of labor unions and labor activists that are trying to push for solutions to climate change, in opposition to what's generally portrayed in the media as labor's reticence to these solutions. Not all unions are opposed to doing something about climate change, but the particular ones that are tend to get portrayed in the media most often, because that's what the media does, right? Our Bloomberg friend can tell us. So that's pretty much what I have. I had a couple charts that showed public support for this. I don't want to take too much more time, but essentially the idea is that across all 50 states, about 46 of the states, more than 50% of people support the language of the Green New Deal resolution. And then when you look at the individual items, you can see there's more support for some things than others. The electric cars only, unfortunately, gets the least amount of support at this point. And that's what I have for you this evening. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Todd. Next up, to put a sociological twist on the big picture, is Dr. Rachel Schwan, who is Associate Director of the Rutgers Energy Institute.
Had to focus very carefully there on getting technology to work. Okay. Thanks for having me here tonight. I'm happy to just give you some thoughts I've had about the Green New Deal. Eric's a sociologist as well, but obviously focuses on the labor. I've been working on climate change issues for about 15 years. So I'm going to try to answer 3 questions, and the first one is, why may addressing inequality help advance climate goals? The second is something I've worked on for a long time, which is, what is public opinion on climate change in the US and support for kind of more traditional policies? And then just a couple of comments on how might the Green New Deal shift public opinion. So one thing that's important to know that comes out of the literature, when you look across nations and kind of all their greenhouse gas emissions, and then you try to take the kind of factors that and figure out what drives greenhouse gas emissions, that kind of 90% of variation in greenhouse gas emissions can be explained by 2 factors of a nation. And that is their population, which makes sense. The more people that are there kind of doing things, right, the more emissions there are. And then also the GDP per capita, right? And that's kind of the economic activity of a nation divided by the number of people, or what we'll sometimes call affluence or wealth, right? It's an indicator of consumption. And so the majority of greenhouse gas emissions can be explained in variation between nations. Oh, they have much lower greenhouse gas emissions. They either have a lower GDP per capita or smaller population, right? And when you look at the kind of influence of population and GDP per capita, those two factors are about the same in kind of influence on greenhouse gas emissions. So if you lower population by 1 unit, you can get kind of a lower, it's 1.14 reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the unit. And the same with GDP per capita. If you lower the GDP by 1 unit, you get kind of a 1.084. But generally they're about 1. Population has a little bit more influence than wealth, but not that much. So as you know, GDP per capita, it really is all the economic activity in a nation divided by all the people. And so it's an average measure of wealth for a nation, right? And then within a nation, you have kind of very different levels of wealth per person. And so these are just some of the GDP per capita. And you can see these numbers are 2014, but the US is there with around $45,000, or 54, sorry. And then going to some very wealthy and smaller nations like Luxembourg. But then we know, right, that the GDP is not split up evenly between every person in the nation so that everybody has $55,000 per person. Rather, it's distributed this way, right? And this is, this is not showing up well for me, but that overwhelmingly, right, that the wealth is concentrated in the top 10%. And it's also distributed this way, right? This is geographically 50% is concentrated in those little orange spots, and then the rest of wealth is distributed in the blue spots around the rest of the US. So not only across, class, but also unevenly distributed geographically. So there were some folks who wanted to find out if the amount of income inequality or income concentration is related to the greenhouse gas emissions. And so, and they did this study for the US where they took all 50 states and broke them down where they had the greenhouse gas emissions for each state. And then they also had a number, you can see the factors here. So GDP per capita for the state is a factor. The number of people, again, those are things that account for a lot of predicting what greenhouse gas emissions are at the state level. They have things like how many environmentalists are in that. State environmentalism, which is a measure of like NGOs and things like that. But they also had a measure, what percent of wealth was in the top 10%. And they found that that was statistically significant and correlated with greenhouse gas emissions. So how much wealth the top 10% held mattered. And it mattered in a positive way in the sense that for every 1% increase of wealth held by the top 10% had between either a 0.1 to 0.13, very small, CO2 increase in emissions, right? And so what this means is that redistribution can be part of the solution. That is, as that number goes down, that percent of income held by the top 10%, as that is spread throughout the population, greenhouse gas emissions can reduce. Additionally, when we think about this, this makes sense to kind of redistribute not only from reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also in thinking about the carbon, what we call carbon intensity of human well-being, right? And that is, you want each emission of carbon, each unit of carbon that we do burn, to kind of increase human well-being as much as possible, right? Or another way to think about it is we want to reduce the carbon per unit of well-being. And when you think about this, then you also understand that redistribution of income can enable an increase in human well-being per unit of carbon emitted, because those folks that are at the top end, who already kind of have, you know, basic needs met plus many other needs met, those are kind of very high emission carbons, high emitting people. So they're doing things like private jets, right, which is a high carbon emission, but as far as kind of human well-being, you're not getting that much bang for your buck, right? And so moving, kind of redistributing that towards, lower income levels, right, makes sense in that there will be carbon emissions coming from that, but higher levels of increases in human well-being. I'm going to move on now to public opinion on climate change and policy. And so we talk about right now, these are numbers from Gallup, and they've been asking these questions year after year. And we talk about right now concern being at an all-time high. And what it actually is 1% higher than it was in 2008, before concern for climate change and belief in climate change in 2008 all took this kind of anywhere from 6 to 10% dive. And there's been a lot of research done to kind of figure out what drove that. There are things around thinking about ClimateGate and people's skepticism about climate change science. There's a lot of talk about the economy and that falling off. So thinking about when people's jobs are at stake, we see even their views change. But now it's rebounded again to kind of higher levels before that big drop off. Anybody studying kind of belief in climate change, there's kind of 3 major factors that predict lower belief in climate change. And that is, if you identify as conservative or Republican, it's overwhelmingly consistent predictor of having lower belief in climate change. Also, males in general very consistently have lower levels of belief in climate change than women, lower levels of risk perception around climate change. What was the third? Just measuring high on any other generally pro-environmental beliefs will predict your climate change beliefs, which isn't very surprising. But you can see here also that as researchers started to break this out more, that those really low levels of belief in climate change come from particularly conservative Republicans, right, or what was now known as the Tea Party Republicans. And that you can get the kind of much more higher levels in belief and support from moderate Republicans there at 62%. Additionally, kind of some of these items are kind of the energy policies. Back when I was doing kind of a survey in 2004, these were the kinds of policies we were talking about around climate change, and then they've kind of been used over again. And you see relatively, right, among registered voters, relatively high support for these kinds of policies, requiring renewables to kind of have a certain amount requiring utilities to have a certain amount of renewables is kind of one of the lower levels of support. And then you can see, again, generally Democrats having higher, Republicans having lower support for these. There's been some research done around designing acceptable climate policies. This is David Amore and Barry Robb and some other folks. And they looked at getting kind of carbon support for carbon tax, right? So if you just ask people, do you support a carbon tax? They're doing this via surveys and kind of changing the language, and giving it to different people. General support for carbon tax at 34%. If they say, do you support carbon tax? It'll cost you $100 a year. That support drops to about 29%. But what they found is that if you give that tax a designated use and say you're going to use it for something, support rises, right? So sometimes they say, do you support a carbon tax? And then that gives you a rebate check. And this gets you to 56%, and the gains in support come more from Republicans, right? So the idea that they pay a tax and get the money back, they find that more feasible or can support that, right? They then said, well, what if we gave you a carbon tax and we use that money, to fund research and development for renewable energy programs, and this gets you to 60%. And then this was kind of across Democrats, Republicans, and Independents expressed support for that. And then they, said, well, they didn't have much interest in paying down the deficit, so that didn't get you much anywhere for your support. And this actually makes a lot of sense because I had done a survey a long time ago asking about these various kind of policies, and then we gave people the opportunity to just give us the reasons why they voted for something or why they didn't. And very often people would say, they would write and say, I don't trust the government to use the money for what they say they're going to use it for, or I don't trust the government to actually put the subsidies towards renewables or to rebate me or any of these things, right? So the idea, that it was going to cost them more, but they weren't going to get the results that they were kind of being promised. And so giving carbon taxes some designated uses that people support or returning it to them increases the feasibility of those kinds of climate policies. Around the Green New Deal, this is data from the Yale Project on Climate Change, which I seem to have cut that off, but this is, people are now hearing about the Green New Deal, so they had done this survey in December 2018 and again in April 2019, right? And you can see the awareness of this growing, basically people who haven't heard about it at all were 81% and 82%, and that's dropped to 41%. At the same time, support kind of has fallen quickly among conservatives, and you can imagine if you were watching the news coverage of this at all, kind of that ramping up of various news media outlets like Fox and kind of going after the Green New Deal. And so you see in December 2018, those who had heard of it having some, Republicans or even conservative Republicans over half saying like, yeah, okay, maybe I'd support that. And then that just kind of falling precipitously by April. So when we think about how the Green New Deal might shift public opinion, I've heard activists speak about this as a project of kind of a longer term shifting around of people's opinions in politics, right, to kind of realign in different ways. This is mainly, I'm speaking mainly in the short term right now, and saying that, certainly I think going to some of the factors that folks talked about before, that building support among those who believe in climate change and kind of are either moderate Republicans or moderate Democrats that might not be super concerned about climate change or super ready to sacrifice a lot, but believe it's happening and it's a risk, that those whose livelihoods are threatened by these policies, that the Green New Deal can do something to really help them be able to more actively support climate change policy. And then we see, right, that this hasn't shifted those kind of Democrat, Republican ideologies and the partisanship around climate change. But there is a potential to kind of maximize and strengthen support for anybody who's really not a, kind of, this doesn't do much for conservatives, I get the feeling, but that, the idea that you can really strengthen support in the middle that hasn't been there before through the Green New Deal is a real opportunity. So, thank you.
Thanks. And our last speaker is Dan Sosland, who is president and CEO of the Acadia Center, and he really works sort of on the ground at the interface of local governments and efforts and federal efforts.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to the network and everyone for being here tonight. I don't know if I can. All right. So, my organization, Acadia Center, is a nonprofit that works on developing policy solutions at the state and regional level, so states and the region can cooperate towards a low-emission economy. And been doing that a while. And when I think of the Green New Deal, we don't really have not really focused on federal action. Acadia Center was founded 20 years ago, just around the time that George Bush became president. And at that time, Dick Cheney did a good job of saying, we're not going to deal with climate. So really, the action has been at the state and local levels. And states and cities and regions have really done a lot over the last 20 years. So the Green New Deal, in a sense, I think one theme that I'm going to try to draw from is leadership. We're really looking at leadership, and we're looking at a call for action. And as the first presentation said, it's a call for action from all of us in this room, all of you who work on this issue, who care about this issue. We have to participate in that call upon us all for leadership. It does a bunch of things in the resolution. It talks about very ambitious, important goals. They're scientifically justified, but they talk about those goals in the context of a just transition to a more just society. And almost every step you would take to reduce emissions and improve and advance clean energy can help equitable distribution of benefits, improve building stock, better mobility for transportation, better public health, better indoor air quality. You go down the list, and all those benefits accrue when you focus on the solutions that exist. So I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership, and leadership coming from the state and regional levels that in the Northeast and the West Coast have been particularly effective at. A lot of what would happen in actual federal legislation would draw from state action, and we have some really good examples that are positive and have paved the way for ultimate federal action. I'll draw a little bit, I'll point to a few of those, and I don't know what's showing up there. My screen looks like things got cut off, but almost, every state in the Northeast and many states across the country have adopted aggressive long-term climate reduction goals. They're working towards those with variations of success. And I think it's just important to recognize that when we think about the United States and its climate policy at the federal level, which is really, what should I say, disappointing. The activities at the state level, the activities at the regional level where states are cooperating, the activities in cities are actually making a difference already and are meeting something like half of the commitment the United States needs to achieve under the Paris Agreement, which the Trump administration is intending to pull out of. Cities are really stepping up to the plate. New York City just passed a law requiring buildings larger than 25,000 square feet, as 50,000 or 55,000 buildings, to reduce greenhouse emissions by 40% by 2030. So you have this happening across the country, and I'm not even including examples from corporations that are looking at closed-loop systems or other players in the economy. States are cooperating and showing that they can work together, developing models. There's two that I'm pointing out here. One is called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which everyone affectionately calls RGGI. It's been in place for a little over 10 years. It sets a cap on emissions from power plants. You have to pay for emitting a ton of CO2. That creates a market. About $3 billion has been invested, mostly in energy efficiency, mostly in renewable energy from this program. In the RGGI states that have tackled capping emissions in the electricity sector, electricity prices have gone down, whereas in states that have not tackled it, electricity prices have gone up. In the RGGI region, GDP grew faster than areas of the country that did not tackle it. And there's a really good reason for it. In our region in the Northeast, when we basically spend money on energy, fossil fuels that come out of the region, that money gets exported. So this model in this region works for these economies. States are now cooperating under an agreement called Transportation Climate Initiative. 12 states and DC are involved in that. They issued an announcement in Bonn. Governors went over there and said states are going to work on this, and transportation has now become the largest emitting sector in the United States and in the Northeast. And there are solutions to address that. So states are starting to cooperate on that as well. These are the founding blocks that show economic, consumer benefits, health benefits from taking action. So real live data in the places that we live and work. It's not theory, it's proven data. And I think that's very important for future federal action. Other things have been happening, and some of these are just really shocking how fast. Offshore wind commitments have been made, and these are just 5 states: Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey. 2014 or so, the only project on the horizon was a small project off Block Island, Rhode Island. That is now the only operational offshore wind facility in the United States. It's working. It's become a tourist attraction. Apparently, it's also helping with fisheries. But what this chart shows is, as states have moved forward to make commitments, it's a dramatic commitment between in just a few short years. That on the books now by 2030 and 2035, states are committing to 18 gigawatts of power. That's enough for about 10 or 11 million homes if those wind farms are built. So we're really talking about a drastic shift in our energy system happening, both with market development, but also with policy drivers, procuring power, seeking to meet those long-term goals, and trying to build a clean economy in the coming years. Part of the point here really is, how do we get the job done? The Green New Deal sets out a massive set of really ambitious and important and very important goals that we really do need. But really, what also must be understood is the solutions exist. We've touched on some of those today in some of the presentations. In all of the major emitting sectors, energy production, transportation, and buildings, those 3 alone, there are solutions that are market ready, the costs are coming down, they're viable, they improve indoor, not just indoor air quality, but comfort. Your house is more comfortable, it's cheaper to operate. And this transition to these technologies, and I'll talk about a few of them briefly, really can be done in a way that also has, when they talk about a just transition, distributes these benefits so that right now we have really poor building stock in low-income areas. We have very inequitable access to transportation. That's the result of specific policies, how we built the interstate highway system, how we developed access to mass transit. Poorer neighborhoods don't have access to mass transit. We can correct all that by investing in infrastructure and by advancing clean energy technologies in these sectors. The chart on the left really is something, just a chart we put together on something called air source heat pumps. You may be familiar with those. They're a technology that operates like an air conditioner, only it produces heat and air conditioning. The 3 large bars on the left show emissions from the average home that uses a oil burner in the house or a natural gas furnace. The 3 bars on the right that are a little more colorful show where emissions dropping when you put an air source heat pump in. They draw electricity, they run on electricity, but even under the current mix of power plants in the Northeast, that blue bar, if it's coming across, that light blue bar, shows you a drastic drop in emissions. They're effective, they heat the homes comfortably. As we decarbonize the electricity system, that emission level will drop even further, and those greens show that the more clean energy we use to generate electricity, the cleaner the air source heat pumps become, the cleaner and lower the contribution of building heating comes to, contributes to global warming. Costs are coming down dramatically. The International Renewable Energy Agency issued a report recently which showed, massive savings with investments in renewable energy in the coming years. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, this is a little chart from one of their articles, shows battery power, the storage was mentioned earlier, dropping dramatically. So markets are in line with this future. Costs are coming down rapidly. And there is a will certainly showing up as evidenced in the Green New Deal resolution and as evidenced in state and regional action to take steps to reduce emissions, with real changes in the market. My organization did a study 2 years ago called Energy Vision 2030, which just said what would happen, what would it take for each of the 7 states in the Northeast region that we looked at, New York and the 6 New England states, to advance these markets towards a goal of 50% emission reductions by 2030. And the reason I put this up there is to show you, the current market levels on the left from 2015, they're quite low, 1% for electric vehicles, 1% for air source heat pumps right now, renewables at about 20%. But if we grow them by the percentages here, on average in this region, up to 5% and then continually on to 17 and 23 and those higher levels which are doable, we will actually have a region that's hitting a 50% reduction in emissions in the next 10 years. That puts you on the trajectory to the deep reduction, 80 to 100% emission reductions needed by 2050 to avoid the worst impacts of global warming. So the point here is this is very doable. The solutions exist, the technology exists, and now we're seeing from the Green New Deal and from other activities, I think certainly increased over the last few years, interest in taking action. What this would look like in certain areas, I'm going to stick with clean heating. This is from a study that was done with Canadian and US different participants. Right now, the way we heat our homes, on the left, it's mostly with gas, it's mostly with oil. Diesel that we use for cars is almost the same as number 2 heating oil. It's very high polluting. What the blue shows that as we transition the technologies for building heating, by 2050, it's almost entirely with heat pumps. Gas and oil disappear. Not entirely, but they're greatly reduced. So what happens with the energy supply, which is the right one, right now, we're living in a world of fossil fuels for heating, of pipeline gas, natural gas, diesel, fuel, number 2, oil, all that. Over time, that will be cut dramatically in half or more, and electricity comes in. Electricity from wind, electricity from solar, electricity from low carbon sources. So the pathways are known, and here's where I want to get a little more sober about it. The challenges and the barriers are very real. There are a lot of legacy regulations that govern the energy system, that influence how we spend transportation dollars, that are not aligned with new technologies and not aligned with the way the markets want to go with clean energy. So to try to give you a sense in a short time, a couple of these on the left, we have a regulatory system that, let's say, a power grid operator says we need more power to avoid blackouts and brownouts. In certain power grids, New Jersey is part of what's called PJM. New England has its own, New York has its own. But in a multi-state one like the New England one with 6 states, if you propose a transmission line, all ratepayers in 6 states participate in paying for it. So a line got built in Maine, traditional fossil fuel line, $1.6 billion. It's paid half by Massachusetts ratepayers. It's paid 8% by people who live in Maine, and they get property taxes on the line. If you have an alternative right now, solar, energy efficiency, that bundle, an alternative to the transmission line, all of that gets paid by the ratepayers in one state. So if you are a regulator, if you are a decision maker, on the one hand, you're faced with paying 8% for something, or you're faced with paying 100% for it. And you don't really have a choice there because your mandate is to lower cost in your state. We have example of this in our regulatory system that governs the way the utilities function, that governs the way the power grids function. It's not aligned with the future we're talking about, and it's a barrier that will impede that future unless it's changed. Another barrier and challenge is natural gas. There's a lot of proponents out there for natural gas to build more pipeline capacity. They call it a bridge fuel to the future because it is cleaner than oil. It's about a third less in emissions. The chart on the right shows that if we just do nothing with natural gas and keep the current consumption in the region, by 2050, all natural gas will produce all of the carbon budget, meaning will consume all of the, produce all of the emissions that could be sustained by the Northeast states by then. If you have no cars, no nothing, just natural gas. So it's really not a bridge fuel. It's a fuel that we have to start to reduce consumption of. But there's a lot of effort to promote natural gas and expand it throughout the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. You've seen this before, even today, I think 2 slides today. This goes back 800,000 years. So what it does is and we could go back 3 million years now with ice core samples. What it says is, concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere have varied between 180 and 300, 290 parts per million through this long period of time. Look what's happened since 1950. It's just really something that we need to take very, very seriously. The IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, has talked about the 10 to 12 year window that we have here. So I really think one point to make is this. We have a limited amount of time, as been said today. That amount of time is not an estimate anymore. It's really the time we have to make the difference. We have the technologies, heat pumps, electric vehicles, solar. We have the knowledge and the costs coming down that they're more affordable and more competitive. But we don't have the public voice calling for it. The barriers we're going to be fighting in the next 10 years, if nothing changes, we're going to be fighting over, should we have more natural gas or not? The utilities want to retain their 17 to 18 cents per kilowatt hour because they're afraid of revenue loss. So they're going to be fighting more than we want them to be, the expansion of solar and community solar and these distributed markets. The PUCs, the rules that govern public utility commissions, that govern how the power grid operates, they have to change too. So really, in the end, when I think of the Green New Deal, and I think of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez spearheading this, she's I think 29 years old, if I have that right. I remember when I first heard about climate change, I had just gotten out of law school, I was walking in New York. I was walking to work along Madison Avenue, and I was getting sick by the time I got to work, and I couldn't figure out why, and I realized it's because the diesel buses were creating so many fumes, and Madison Avenue was creating a tunnel. I was walking through this tunnel of fumes. The article came out about climate change, and I'm like, this has got to change fast. That was 30 years ago. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was born that year, 1989. So I think one thing we want to point to is this generational change that's occurring. People 30 and under, whatever age you pick, a younger generation coming in, they get it. The Green Party in the European elections recently came in second in Germany. There's going to be a substantial contingency in the European Parliament of Green Party pro-climate activists. We have now in our Congress a climate change caucus and led by young people. The Sunrise Movement, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Sunrise Movement. They have been incredible in getting the House, once it switched parties, to take action. That's led by people in their 20s. So one thing to think about here is the impact on the future generation, we talk about children and grandchildren, we now have the people who get it, that this is affecting their lives and their future. This isn't something 40 years away. This is now. And they're taking action. I think all of us have to respond to that call for leadership and that call for that generation to that wants to take this on, and they want everyone to participate and have it be done fairly. And I would leave with that thought that everyone in this room can participate in that call for action, respond to that call for leadership, and that's what we're going to need to make the next 10 years matter. And that's the time we've got. So thank you.
Thanks for these 4 very in-depth presentations. So in-depth, we have sort of hit our time limit. If our speakers are game and anybody else is interested, I'm happy to do a couple speed rounds of questions from the audience, if you have any, if that sounds like a good idea. Great. Thanks everyone for staying in, for your attention. So, I mean, I have questions, but I think we're more interested in hearing what your thoughts and concerns are. If anybody has questions, show of hands. And let's try to keep the questions just very short, given the time. I think this woman in the front row had her hand up first.
Thank you very much for these presentations. I feel like I'm having like a brain expansion. I'm wondering that has anybody done a cost-benefit analysis on the Green New Deal? I know it's very complicated. You have a lot of costs coming in. You have a lot of benefits coming out of it. That's number one. Number two, read about a month and a half ago in the Financial Times, there was an op-ed about a gentleman talking about the Green New Deal and liking the whole concept, but wondering if there are enough really, materials to carry it out because of the demand on some of the what would you call them? The elements for solar power.
Okay, so any thoughts? Cost benefit of Green New Deal and whether we have the resources to pull this off.
Yeah, no, there's no cost benefit analysis of any rigor associated with this. In part because it's not really a distinct set of policies. It's aspirational. It's kind of like we're going to do all these things, but no one's fleshed it out and put numbers on it. And even if they did, they would be very squishy. The question of sort of rapid transition to renewables and the rare earths is probably the mineral constraints that you're thinking of. They're used in wind turbines and other sources. Those are, potential obstacles, but I wouldn't spend. They're not the biggest obstacle. Markets are pretty good at overcoming resource shortages if there's sufficient push and profitability behind them. So.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts there?
Maybe kind of a little bit about the cost-benefit analysis. There's a article I read about 2 days ago that talked about the percent of GDP that we're currently spending just on extreme weather events and the projections of that into the future. I think on that alone, the Green New Deal is cheaper because we're talking getting 10, 15, 20% of GDP dealing with storm recovery. I mean, that's a tremendous.
Do you remember where you read that?
It may have been The Guardian. I don't recall.
Okay. Third row over here.
My question is, suppose we are able to get this going but within, the time 10 years from now. How about the rest of the world? How does what we do affect everyone else and what the rest of the world is doing? I mean, do we have any control over that?
We control the rest of the world,
everywhere,
right?
Africa, Australia, China.
Any
If
thoughts?
we do it, how do we know anybody else is going to follow suit?
Well, in terms of the energy transition that I was talking about, that's likely to happen faster elsewhere than here. So these are global industries, and these phenomena of falling costs around batteries and solar panels, and the move towards autonomous electric vehicles, those are global phenomenons, and they are, significantly market driven. So it's really just a question of, it's going to happen everywhere around the world. All these things are. It's a question of, as we were talking about the state and local policies, do you even have a policy in your community that allows the siting of batteries and solar panels? These are the kind of things that will determine the speed at which those particular initiatives unfold. So, yeah.
Dan?
I don't have the numbers in my head, and we know China and India are big emitters, but China is doing an awful lot with electric vehicles, with solar, with getting off of coal. And actually, I think one way to think about this is we're behind, we're not ahead. I was recently in Quebec for a week, and they are building an entirely new electric train network around Montreal. They have we were taken to a factory where they're building electric school buses, electric garbage trucks. They're working with California in a market. Canada is, embracing, not all of Canada, but some of it, this new economy. That's their future. In Europe, there's wind all over the place. There's solar. There's congestion pricing in London and other cities. I think, in effect, we're kind of parochial when it comes to thinking that we're still the technology leader of the world. You go around the world, it's a very sobering experience as an American, So I think the rest of the world is doing this. The rest of the world is part of the Paris Accord. I'm not going to be Pollyannish about that, but we are one of the few countries that is not. And when you look at what states are issuing compliance policies with the Paris Agreement, that's what's going on out there. And I think that probably is a story that isn't really told in the United States very much.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Rachel?
I was going to say, in addition, I don't know what you've heard is kind of what drove down solar prices, but I know I've heard that like Germany and kind of their investment in solar was part of what helped drive that down. I don't know what you.
Yeah, well, it's really the solar story is just an incredible success story of international government policy. So, the U.S. has had very active solar policy for 40 years. So have the Germans, so have the Chinese. The stimulus package of 2009 put more money into green tech than had ever been put into U.S. green tech over the entire period, and then the Chinese stepped in. So it really is an incredible success story of different countries pulling on the same oar and then delivering a technology that it's kind of like the cavalry riding in at the last minute might actually save the day.
Just want to make sure we're okay for a few minutes, Rhoda. We can go for a few more minutes? Okay. The question over here, and then over here, and we'll get back over there too.
Okay, we have a very large movement in this area against the Meadowlands power plant, and the biggest obstacle we're facing is what you were talking about, the construction trade unions. And I'm a union person. I'm at a United Federation of Teachers, but the biggest opposition is from the unions. We also have politicians like Senator Booker and Congressman Pascrell who have now come out for the Green New Deal, but they will not take a stand on the local issue of the power plant. And I think it is to do with the money and the support from the unions. We need your help. We need your help. We have to. We're not anti-union. We're pro-union people, but.
So Todd, how do you intervene?
This is the $1 million question I get asked everywhere I go, and if I had the magic answer, believe me, we would have addressed it by now. I will say a couple comments though. Having been a union carpenter myself for many years, I think something a lot of people don't understand about the nature of that industry is the construction industry by design is intermittent employment and unemployment. So workers that are employed in construction get hired to build a skyscraper. They work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 months. They get laid off. And then they're waiting for another job. They call the union hall every Friday. Is there another job? Is there another job? Is there another job? Now, thankfully, because of the union structure, they're able to get the same wages across those multiple employers. They may work for 50 or 60 employers over the course of a career. and they're able to carry their benefits forward, and it's the same retirement plan, even though they may work for 50 different companies and be unemployed 4 or 5 months out of each year, right? So that's helpful for them economically, but it creates a really incentive for the union to constantly drum up support for any and every kind of construction, what I call an all of the above construction policy. So the building trades unions are just as likely to support a natural gas power plant as they are the offshore wind farms off the coast, right? As long as it's going to create good jobs, they're going to support it. So part of the point that I tried to make earlier is that the fossil fuel industry has really taken advantage of that and has essentially embraced unions in a way that most industries in the whole country have never embraced unions, because they see them as a powerful political ally in getting these projects passed in a time of uncertainty. I would argue that, you know, for folks in the room that are consumers of solar or would like to purchase renewable energy, write a letter to the companies that you support and say, listen, you know, we're union supporters. If your workers are there trying to organize a union, let them organize a union if they want it. Don't interfere. Because if we can build that kind of political support on the renewable side, then that changes the political equation. So that's just kind of my thoughts. I wish I had a better answer. Keep organizing.
Gentleman over here, and then over there in the top in the green shirt.
There was some discussion of efficiency as far as kilowatt hour costs and also environmental impact of going with the Green Revolution, Green New Deal. The question that I have is, does this also consider capital costs, such as the cost of recycling batteries, recycling solar cells, the total environmental impact? Does it consider that issue as well?
Yeah, but this is clearly something you have to think about. As we move towards a solar plus storage system, it's a whole new industrial process. I mean, the good news is that in lithium is a very recyclable material. And that's the basis of most of the batteries these days. So, and also what's interesting about, for example, vehicle batteries is that even after they've gone through their use in vehicles, they still have kind of 80% of their capacity, so they can be sort of bundled to produce more kind of residential or commercial storage opportunities. So it's a system that's basically calling out for recycling, and I think it'll be a relatively easy lift to ensure that that happens.
Gentleman in the hat in the back. Oh.
The presentation tonight, there was no mention of nuclear, and I was wondering, is there no future for nuclear energy?
That's correct. I mean, it's just wildly expensive. I mean, a new nuclear plant costs $10 billion and takes 15 years to build. So there's not a private investor in the world that will touch a nuclear power plant, especially given the fact that you would have to, in order for it to pay for itself, it would have to have a captive audience for 30 years in a world that's rapidly moving towards distributed energy. So outside of authoritarian regimes like China, you're just really not going to see much in the way of new nuclear construction. That said, I mean, I'm an advocate of keeping the old plants going as long as they're safe.
There's a gentleman over here, and then two over there, and then we should probably respect the schedule and move online.
I'm challenged by the idea of how to get more people to agree on the importance of the issue, and it seemed to me a hang-up is that we tend to make a decision on action if we think there's some feasibility involved. But if I have some strange sound in my house and I don't know what to do about it, I'm willing to say, well, it's no big deal, and so why bother? It seems like many of you have mentioned the kind of factors that could show that converting to green energy, to a green economy, is very feasible. That's one of the appeals of Drawdown to me, the book that shows here are 80 proven technologies. You don't have to change anything, let alone make solar more efficient. If that's the case, it seems like the biggest task we have is how do we convince people that the future is feasible to do all this? It's a big feasibility promotion by that thinking. What do you think?
There has to be more awareness raised about the fact that these technologies exist, that they're cost effective. You know, one way to look at this in part is energy efficiency measures in households or heat pumps or solar on the roof. You have to educate the vendors. Vendors are coming in to sell you your heating system goes, and right now they're trained to come in. Let's say you have oil, they're going to come in and they're going to often just recommend another oil furnace. And I know from personal experience, sometimes if they sell enough, by the end of the month, they literally get a trip to Florida or something. So there has to be programs, and state policies can actually do this, and they are starting in certain states to educate vendors about alternatives. So when something happens in your home with your heating system, say, hey, maybe you want to think about a heat pump. It's cost effective. So there's a wide array of areas where awareness can be raised in the marketplace through policy interaction that's supporting market development with small businesses getting in, where there's efficiency vendors, people who sell heating products, all of that. And more effort has to be put into that, and I think but that's just one example. I think that's with this call to action that I'm talking about. Really, we all need to get more educated and figure out a way to get information out there, because this is the future. That's going to be how the households are years from now. We have to accelerate that change. And so the more information that can get out there and the more we're all aware of it, the more choices we can make that are aligned with low-emitting homes and buildings. Somehow there has to be more emphasis on public education about it.
And to make that concrete, I mean, the technologies I talked about have really strong market tailwinds, and so they're going to be substantially cheaper and more profitable than the existing ones. But there's still those other 100 things that we have to do. And so what I would urge everybody to do would be to get that book Drawdown, find your favorite solution, the one you just love, and then really get educated about it and start going to your city council and visiting the state government here and talking to your representatives, because you really need to change the rules in order to raise awareness and sort of change incentives to get those things in place soon, because we don't have a lot of time. So I think picking the solution that you're passionate about and then really engaging politically, and by that I mean talking to your city council member, going to your state reps, really getting on them, is not sexy, but it's really the only solution.
Okay, and
the fifth frequently asked question in Drawdown.
It's disrespectful to the other questioners to just pop in. We'll get to two more after these two, and then we should probably call it.
So I was wondering, the Green New Deal, the people behind the Green New Deal in Washington, don't you think it would be advisable to have some kind of national committee where they look at the whole nation and they create federal mandates for different states? It's like a state of an emergency, and there's depending upon climate conditions and different surveys that they could do, they could see what's the best marginal utility that they could get from different energy, and then create federal mandates.
Sounds like the Clean Power Plan.
Yeah. So I was wondering if that's being done, because you think that you'd have the best theory and application that way.
It's already been done, and it's being repealed. I mean, there was an adequate description you just made of the Obama Clean Power Plan, which went state by state and developed very technical performance metrics for clean energy, and it's I can't remember where that particularly.
His last act,
right?
Before
His last act
before he died was to put a stay on that, and then the Trump folks just killed it. So that was the approach that Obama followed.
Hi. I've been studying the Green New Deal. My Ramapo College class is coming out with a report next week on some recommendations. One of the things we're responding to is it's taken a tremendous beating. It's been criticized for many, many things, fairly and unfairly. It's too comprehensive, and people don't handle comprehensiveness well. It's too bold. They're naive. It's too and a zillion other things. So we're trying to address that. So if anybody's interested, see me for next week. But one or two things I think we do to ourselves. This idea that I see all the time that we have to give up on conservatives. I'm having trouble accepting that, because I think at the end of the day, we need them badly, and we have to figure out ways to address them. And the other thing that I think we do to ourselves, didn't come up today, but we're seeing in the Democratic primary, basically it's seen as a war between the progressives and the centrists. And I think at the end of the day, they need each other. And we just saw that with Joe Biden's so-called centrist plan looked pretty good. So any opinion on whether these political divisions are really that real?
Thank you.
I think realistically, the Green New Deal is a great motivating conversational thing, but I mean, I think the odds of the Democrats taking the Senate are low. I mean, that's going to have to happen for anything to happen, but they're not going to have anything close to a supermajority. So I'm not really hopeful for federal climate policy after 2020 of any significance. And so I think that really the action has to be at the state and local level, because that's really where we can make a difference. You know, obviously we need the federal politicians to keep sounding the horn and changing public opinion. But I think that the Green New Deal and all of the other Democratic plans are just aspirational at this point. The politics isn't there nationally, but what we can do get a lot done in our communities and in our states. Because, you know, the blue states are 60–70% of GDP in the United States. So that's my take on it.
I'm a big fan of aspirational and vision. I think it's motivational for people. It's an excellent organizing tool to get people to galvanize around a topic. And just from a labor studies perspective and from my own experience as being a labor activist, when you're bargaining to win something, you know, you shoot for the stars and you hit the moon. You don't come out of the box asking for what you think you can get. You come out of the box asking for the world, and you fight like hell for it, and you get the best thing that you can out of the deal in the end. So the Green New Deal is that.
Rhoda, are you?
If we could take one more question.
Okay, the gentleman in the Yankees hat.
I can talk pretty loudly. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
I've been getting a lot of promotion. I've been approached by a lot of companies lately telling me about zero cost to homeowners solar panel installation in New Jersey because there is some program of this nature, and I've been doing a lot of reading. What's hidden in this that I'd like to know about before jumping aboard? Anybody know about New Jersey's plans?
I can't speak to New Jersey. I can say in other states, one of the things to be careful about is they may own the equipment after you pay. Okay.
That's the one I was talking about.
Well, I mean, I think right now it's a better deal to borrow money and buy the thing yourself. I did that in New York, and I just swapped out a loan payment for my utility payment. So it was a zero increase cost, and in 15 years I'll own the system. Mm-hmm. So it's an awesome. It was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you again for the questions.
Okay, and thank you all for coming. I hope you felt that you learned a lot tonight. I know I did, and we'll look forward to seeing all the good things that can happen in the future as we move toward helping our climate. Thank you.